on the heels of this celebration of birth that we just had. Can't count, but it's just a couple days ago that we had Christmas Eve, right? We now find ourselves in what I would consider the strangest of times. Biblically, there's an abrupt transition. It's jarring almost when you read it. From this infant baby Jesus to all of a sudden, Jesus is a much more developed Son of God, 30 years old. Infant to 30. Now, I know as a parent, it feels like that's how it happens, but historically, it doesn't really happen that way, right? There are some years and some milestones in between those events. Luke is the only gospel to even present a small depiction of a non-infant Jesus, a depiction of Jesus as a child, and that comes 12 entire years after his birth. Now, again, it goes fast, but not 12 years in the blink of an eye or the turn of a page. Can you imagine writing about a Messiah that's coming for years and years and years, and then that miracle baby finally arriving in a beautiful way into this world, and then disappearing from Scripture for 30 years until his baptism? Doesn't make much sense, does it? Strange is the only apt word for that sequence of events. And now historians and theologians would present numerous answers why this is the case, but let's be honest, they're all pretty boring. Childhood and coming of age is the most interesting time in our lives. It's full of stories. It's full of lessons. It's full of growth and development. And I'm certain that it would be encouraging to us to hear those stories, to see those things. This time period has produced some of the most successful things in literature and television and movies. Where would we be without To Kill a Mockingbird, right? Catcher in the Rye, Huckleberry Finn. What about The Wonder Years, right? Or Happy Days, or Dawson's Creek, or The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And let's not leave out Stand By Me, or The Breakfast Club, or Boys in the Hood. That was big for me. The truth is that there's a time in our lives that resonates with everyone. This is the time when we take the greatest leaps in our lives. So why leave it out? I wrestled with that all week. We could just tell the story, but it matters why. And for a while I was wrestling this week, it did make sense. But then I spent some time with my kids, and a different image presented itself. This Christmas, we didn't do anything. We didn't go anywhere. We didn't have any plans. We didn't go to any parties. We just stayed at home and hung out together. And that was a beautiful time. It really was. No prepping to be anywhere and no prepping to be anything, just being. We spent the day together. We laughed and we played together. We napped and we snuggled together. We cooked and we ate together, and we even did monotonous routine things like changing diapers and doing dishes together. And through just being, you really get to see the heart of your kids. And I have a feeling that my kids are a lot like your kids, pure. That they're honest and they're blunt, that they're compassionate and forgiving, that they're resilient and curious, that they're loving and hopeful. I got to watch my daughter, Ember, develop her first interest in food. Got to watch her dive bombing to try to get a taste of what mom's been eating. Not yet, little girl, not yet. And I got to watch my son, Gibson, give me the grace and love that I strive to give everyone else every time I step out of that door, with an ease, as though it was just as easy as walking. And frankly, that's when it hit me. They didn't leave out Jesus' coming of age story because it was boring. No. They didn't leave it out because it wasn't ripe with lessons and takeaways. They left it out because children are love. They're chock full of hope and dreams of a naive trust in people that I truly wish was never broken. And they're filled to the brim with joy and exude a light that shines even in the dark corners of this life. But that's not news to us. That's not a profound truth. We know it because we've lived it. We've watched it time and time again, but in our world, that light that we see in our children, that light that once shone so bright, it gets dimmed over time. Over years and years of the toils of this life, over the realities of adulthoods and the struggles of survival, until one day we look down and we no longer see that light. And that, my friends, is the world that Jesus steps into. And what's more remarkable than a light that shines among lights? Well, a light that shines in the darkness. Our scripture today is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, and it says, every year Jesus' parents traveled to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as they always did for the feast. And when it was over, they left for home. The child, Jesus, stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents didn't know it. Thinking that he was somewhere in the company of pilgrims, they journeyed for a whole day and began looking for him among relatives and neighbors. And when they didn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem looking for him. And the next day they found him in the temple seated among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And the teachers were all quite taken with him, impressed with the sharpness of his answers. But his parents were not impressed, as you can imagine. They were upset and hurt. And his mother said, young man, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been half out of our minds looking for you. And he said, why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that I had to be here dealing with the things of my father? But they had no idea what he was talking about. And so he went back to Nazareth with them and lived obediently with them. And his mother held these things deeply and dearly within herself. And Jesus matured, growing in both body and spirit, blessed by both God and people. You know, the most alarming thing in this scripture is that they lost their kid, right? I mean, can you imagine losing your kid? It's bad enough to lose one of these little rascals, right? Just a regular kiddo. But this isn't a regular kiddo. This is the Son of God. Can you imagine the nightmares that they packed up and somehow left without the kid? The Messiah. That they packed their clothes and their snacks for the road. But the Messiah, no, he's with pilgrims somewhere. He's good. And they couldn't find him for not one, and not two, but 3 minutes, no, hours, no, days, 3 days. Can you imagine that? I mean, maybe you've lost your kid or you've been lost as a kid. It's terrifying even for just a couple minutes, right? Where's my mom? And the thoughts that must race through your head in those moments. You know those thoughts that run into your head immediately after you got frustrated with your child? After you said something that you didn't mean, you were a little bit harsher than you probably ought to be. And you just apologize to God and you just think, I don't know what I would do without this kid. I'm sorry. They mean the world to me. They are what the psalmist says in Psalm 127, God's best gift to us. Because what would we do without our light? What would we do? In this passage, Jesus quite clearly demonstrates that he's not like the other kids. He's just not. There's a foreshadowing that takes place here that he is right in the place that he's always been, in his Father's house. Not Joseph, but God. And it's in that house, that dwelling place of God, that Jesus is unwilling to leave. To just go through the motions and join the caravan like all the other children did. But no, not Jesus, not the Son of God. He needed to stay in the light just a little bit longer. And we know that Jesus went back home. And he continued to grow and to develop in body and spirit. And we know how this story ends, right? But just as much as the beginning and the end matter, the middle is just as crucial. The moment that the Word became flesh, the light became ours to hold and to cherish, and most of all, to carry. In Mary's womb, on the back of a donkey, in John's arms in the middle of the Jordan, and on a cross out on a hill outside of Jerusalem. A light that cannot, that will not, that shall not be extinguished. And my friends, as I look into my children's eyes, I see the light of God. And as I look out into these pews, I see that same light. The truth of the world manifested right before our eyes. And light begets light. And while I can't tell you all the pieces that were left out of the story, I can tell you the piece that wasn't. Again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And whether you're 13 or 93, your coming of age story hasn't finished quite yet. There's a lot of room left for light in your life. And the question is, are you ready to find it again? And that is and shall always be up to you. Thanks be to God.
These are guitars, potato. This is the hope of God set free. These are guitars.